The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palazzo Vecchio as Lorenzo de' Medici walked through the corridors that had witnessed centuries of political maneuvering. His footsteps echoed with the confidence of a man who understood that power was not inherited but seized, not given but taken. In his hand he carried a leather-bound manuscript that would forever change how the world understood the art of ruling, Niccolò Machiavelli's treatise on power. The year was 1513, and Florence buzzed with the tension of a city-state caught between empires. In the dimly lit study where Machiavelli penned his revolutionary thoughts, the former diplomat understood something that most of his contemporaries missed entirely. Power was not about birthright or divine mandate. It was about strategy, perception, and the ruthless application of will. As he dipped his quill into the ink, he wrote words that would echo through the ages. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. This principle would become the cornerstone of what modern leaders call executive presence, though Machiavelli understood it as something far more profound: the art of becoming unoutShined. In the political theater of Renaissance Italy, where a single misstep could mean exile or death, Machiavelli observed that those who rose to power and maintained it possessed certain unmistakable qualities. They moved through the world with the bearing of champions, not because they were born to it, but because they had mastered the fundamental laws of human nature and power dynamics. The first law Machiavelli identified was the law of perception management. In the courts of Florence, Milan, and Rome, he watched as skilled politicians crafted their public image with the precision of master artisans. They understood that reality was less important than perception, and that perception could be shaped, molded, and directed. The Duke of Valentinois, Cesare Borgia, whom Machiavelli both admired and feared, exemplified this principle perfectly. Borgia never appeared in public without careful consideration of how his presence would be interpreted. His clothing, his posture, his facial expressions. Everything was calculated to project strength, intelligence, and inevitable victory. When Borgia entered a room, conversation stopped, not because he demanded attention through loud proclamations or dramatic gestures, but because his very presence communicated mastery. Machiavelli noted that Borgia had learned to control not just his words but his silences. With Trostetti, he understood that a well-timed pause could be more powerful than the most eloquent speech. His eyes never wavered when he spoke to someone, regardless of their station, because he knew that direct eye contact communicated both confidence and respect, two qualities that made others naturally defer to his judgment. This mastery of presence extended far beyond mere theatrics. Machiavelli observed that true champions of power understood the delicate balance between approachability and authority. They were never so distant as to seem cold or disconnected, yet never so familiar as to diminish their mystique. They mastered what Machiavelli called sprezzatura, the art of making difficult things appear effortless. When Borgia negotiated treaties, commanded armies, or settled disputes, he did so with a casual grace that made his extraordinary capabilities seem natural and inevitable. The second law that emerged from Machiavelli's observations was the law of strategic timing. In the volatile world of Renaissance politics, timing was everything. Those who succeeded understood not just what to do, but when to do it. They possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the currents of political fortune and position themselves accordingly. Machiavelli watched as the most successful leaders seemed to anticipate events before they occurred, not through mystical foresight, but through careful observation and strategic thinking. Pope Julius II, despite his religious vocation, demonstrated this principle with remarkable clarity. When the time came to expand papal territories, he didn't wait for perfect conditions. He created them. He understood that opportunity was not something that happened to you, but something you manufactured through careful preparation and bold action. Julius would spend months laying the groundwork for a military campaign, building alliances, securing resources, and positioning his forces, all while maintaining the public facade of a peaceful religious leader. When he finally struck, his enemies were so thoroughly outmaneuvered that resistance seemed futile. Machiavelli noted that Julius possessed what he termed the champion's intuition, the ability to sense when the moment for action had arrived. This wasn't mystical insight, but rather the result of systematic observation and pattern recognition. Julius studied his opponents, understood their weaknesses and motivations, and recognized the subtle signs that indicated when they were vulnerable. He never acted from emotion or impulse, but from calculated assessment of probability and advantage. The art of strategic timing also required what Machiavelli called active patience, the discipline to wait for the right moment while continuously preparing for action. Lesser leaders might see this preparation period as inactivity, but champions understood it as the most crucial phase of any undertaking. They used this time to gather intelligence, build coalitions, acquire resources, and position themselves for maximum impact when they finally moved. The third law Machiavelli identified was perhaps the most controversial: the law of necessary ruthlessness. In his observations of successful rulers, he noticed that they all possessed the capacity for decisive action, even when that action required difficult choices. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, but rather the understanding that leadership sometimes demanded sacrifices that others weren't willing to make. The champion's willingness to make these hard decisions was precisely what separated them from those who remained perpetually in supporting roles. Francesco Sforza, who rose from mercenary captain to Duke of Milan, embodied this principle completely. Sforza understood that in the pursuit of power, half measures were often worse than no action at all. When he decided to seize control of Milan, he didn't hesitate or equivocate. He moved with the swift decisiveness that left his enemies no time to organize effective resistance. Machiavelli noted that Sforza's success came not from superior numbers or resources, but from his willingness to commit completely to his chosen course of action. This ruthlessness extended beyond military campaigns to every aspect of leadership. When Sforza identified incompetence or disloyalty within his organization, he addressed it immediately and definitively. He understood that allowing problems to fester was a form of weakness that others would exploit. His subordinates learned that excellence was not just encouraged but required, and that mediocrity would not be tolerated. This created an atmosphere of high performance that became self-reinforcing. Talented individuals were drawn to his service because they knew they would be working alongside other exceptional people. However, Machiavelli was careful to distinguish between necessary ruthlessness and arbitrary cruelty. The most effective leaders, he observed, were those who used force and decisive action strategically, not emotionally. They never acted from anger or personal vendetta, but from calculated assessment of what was required to achieve their objectives. Their ruthlessness was surgical, precise, and always served a larger purpose. This restraint actually enhanced their power because subordinates and allies knew that their leaders' harsh decisions came from rational analysis rather than unpredictable emotion. As Machiavelli continued his observations throughout the tumultuous years of the early 16th century, he began to see how these three laws worked together to create what he termed the champion's aura, an almost magnetic quality that made certain individuals naturally dominant in any situation. This wasn't mere charisma, though charisma was certainly part of it. It was something deeper and more fundamental, the projection of absolute competence and unshakable confidence. The champions Machiavelli studied had learned to inhabit their power completely. They didn't pretend to be powerful or act as if they were powerful. They simply were powerful, and this authenticity was impossible to fake or replicate. Their self-assurance was so complete that it became contagious. People around them began to feel more confident and capable simply by association. This created a virtuous cycle where the champion's success attracted talented allies, whose contributions enhanced the champion's capabilities, which in turn attracted even more capable supporters. This phenomenon was particularly evident in the court of Lorenzo de' Medici. Despite lacking formal political titles, Lorenzo wielded influence that extended far beyond Florence's borders. Kings and popes sought his counsel, artists competed for his patronage, and merchants adjusted their strategies based on his preferences. His power didn't derive from inherited position or accumulated wealth alone, but from his masterful application of Machiavellian principles. Lorenzo understood that true power lay not in commanding obedience through fear, but in inspiring voluntary cooperation through demonstrated excellence. He made himself indispensable by becoming genuinely valuable to others. His political advice was sought because it was invariably sound. His cultural judgments were respected because they consistently proved prescient. His business partnerships flourished because he brought genuine value to every transaction. This created a network of relationships based on mutual benefit rather than mere obligation, making his position far more secure than any throne backed only by tradition or force. The champion's approach to competition was another crucial element Machiavelli identified. Unlike ordinary ambitious individuals who saw others as obstacles to overcome, champions viewed competition as an opportunity to demonstrate superiority. They didn't avoid strong opponents, they sought them out, understanding that victory over worthy adversaries enhanced their reputation far more than easy wins against weak opposition. Giuliano della Rovere, who would later become Pope Julius II, rather than taking the safe path of avoiding confrontation with powerful rivals, Giuliano deliberately positioned himself in opposition to the most formidable figures of his era. When he challenged the Borgia family's dominance, he wasn't being reckless. He was making a calculated decision that defeating such powerful enemies would establish his credentials as a force to be reckoned with. Giuliano's approach to these confrontations revealed another key aspect of the champion mentality: the ability to maintain composure under extreme pressure. While his enemies resorted to increasingly desperate measures as their positions weakened, Giuliano remained calm and methodical. He understood that panic was contagious, and that maintaining his equilibrium would help his allies stay focused while potentially causing his enemies to make crucial mistakes. This composure under pressure was not natural talent but learned skill. Machiavelli observed that successful leaders systematically expose themselves to increasingly challenging situations, building their tolerance for stress and uncertainty. They practiced making decisions with incomplete information, learned to function effectively despite opposition and criticism, and developed the mental resilience necessary to persist through setbacks and failures. The practice of deliberate challenge-seeking served multiple purposes beyond building personal resilience. It demonstrated to potential allies and enemies alike that the champion was not someone who could be easily intimidated or deterred. It provided opportunities to develop new skills and capabilities that would prove valuable in future endeavors. Most importantly, it created a track record of overcoming difficulties that enhanced credibility when facing future challenges. Machiavelli noted that champions also possessed an unusual relationship with failure. While most people sought to avoid failure or hide it when it occurred, champions used failure as raw material for future success. They analyzed their defeats with the same systematic attention they gave to their victories, extracting lessons that made them more formidable opponents in subsequent encounters. Cesare Borgia's response to his father's death and his subsequent fall from power, rather than wallowing in self-pity or making excuses, Borgia immediately began analyzing what had gone wrong and how similar situations might be handled differently in the future. Even in defeat, he maintained the bearing and confidence of a champion, which helped him retain the loyalty of key supporters and eventually stage a partial comeback. This attitude toward failure reflected a deeper understanding of what Machiavelli called the long game. Champions thought in terms of decades rather than months, understanding that temporary setbacks were inevitable parts of any significant undertaking. They were willing to accept short-term losses in pursuit of long-term advantages, a perspective that gave them tremendous strategic flexibility. The ability to think in extended time horizons also influenced how champions built and maintained their power bases. Rather than relying solely on immediate rewards and punishments to secure loyalty, they invested in developing genuine relationships with key supporters. They understood that power based purely on fear or greed was inherently unstable, while power built on mutual respect and shared interests could endure for generations. Lorenzo de' Medici's cultivation of the intellectual and artistic communities in Florence demonstrated this long-term approach to power building. By supporting scholars, artists, and writers, Lorenzo wasn't just indulging personal interests, he was creating a cultural environment that enhanced Florence's reputation and influence throughout Europe. The intellectuals he patronized became ambassadors for Florentine values and interests, extending Lorenzo's influence far beyond what formal diplomatic channels could achieve. This investment in cultural power proved remarkably durable. Long after Lorenzo's death, Florence continued to benefit from the reputation he had built for the city as a center of learning and artistic excellence. The relationships he had fostered between Florentine institutions and intellectual leaders throughout Europe continued to provide political and economic advantages for decades. The champion's approach to alliance building revealed another crucial insight from Machiavelli's observations. Successful leaders understood that the strongest alliances were those where each party brought unique and valuable capabilities to the relationship. Rather than seeking allies who were simply extensions of their own strengths, champions actively recruited partners whose skills complemented their own. This principle was clearly visible in the rise of Francesco Sforza to power in Milan. Sforza's military genius was unquestionable, but he recognized that military prowess alone was insufficient for long-term political success. He systematically cultivated relationships with skilled administrators, talented diplomats, and successful merchants, creating a leadership team whose combined capabilities far exceeded what any individual could achieve alone. Sforza's approach to delegation within these alliances demonstrated another key aspect of champion behavior. Rather than micromanaging his allies or insisting on making every important decision personally, he gave his partners genuine authority within their areas of expertise. This not only made his organization more effective, but also increased his allies' investment in shared success. They weren't just following orders, they were contributing their best efforts to enterprises they partially controlled. This willingness to share power and authority required tremendous confidence and security. Lesser leaders often hoarded decision-making authority because they feared that delegating would diminish their importance or control. Champions understood that their role was not to make every decision, but to ensure that the right decisions got made. By surrounding themselves with capable partners and giving those partners room to excel, champions actually enhanced rather than diminished their own power. The psychological aspects of champion behavior fascinated Machiavelli throughout his years of observation. He noticed that successful leaders possessed an unusual combination of supreme confidence and genuine humility. They were absolutely certain of their ability to achieve their objectives, yet remained open to learning from anyone who could teach them something valuable. This paradox was resolved through their understanding that confidence and humility served different functions and operated in different domains. Their confidence was directed outward, toward the challenges and obstacles they faced. When confronting difficulties, champions never doubted their ability to find solutions. This certainty wasn't based on naive optimism, but on extensive experience overcoming problems. They had systematically built their capabilities and proven their effectiveness in increasingly demanding situations. Their confidence was earned rather than assumed. Their humility was directed inward, toward their own knowledge and understanding. Champions recognized that the world was complex and rapidly changing, and that yesterday's solutions might not work for tomorrow's problems. They actively sought out new information, alternative perspectives, and creative approaches. They were quick to acknowledge when others had better ideas or more relevant expertise. This combination of external confidence and internal humility created a learning orientation that kept champions adaptive and effective as circumstances changed. They never became complacent or rigid in their thinking, yet never appeared uncertain or indecisive to those who depended on their leadership. Pope Julius II exemplified this balance throughout his reign. In public, he projected absolute certainty about the righteousness of his cause and the inevitability of his success. His speeches and proclamations left no doubt about his determination or his expectations. Yet in private councils, he actively solicited diverse opinions and carefully weighed alternative strategies. He was secure enough in his position to admit when he didn't know something and confident enough in his judgment to make final decisions even when his advisors disagreed. The champion's relationship with information and intelligence gathering was another area where Machiavelli identified distinctive patterns. Successful leaders understood that information was a form of power, and they invested heavily in acquiring, analyzing, and acting upon high-quality intelligence. They built networks of informants and advisors that extended far beyond their immediate circle, giving them early warning of emerging threats and opportunities. However, champions were careful to avoid information paralysis, the tendency to endlessly gather data without ever taking action. They understood that perfect information was never available and that waiting for certainty was often a form of failure. Instead, they developed the judgment necessary to act decisively based on incomplete but sufficient information. Lorenzo de' Medici's intelligence network exemplified this balanced approach. He maintained correspondences with merchants, diplomats, scholars, and clerks throughout Italy and beyond, creating an early warning system that often gave him weeks or months of advance notice about developing situations. Yet he never allowed the complexity of the information he received to prevent him from making timely decisions. He had learned to distinguish between essential facts that required immediate attention and interesting details that could be considered at leisure. The processing of this intelligence required what Machiavelli observed as another champion characteristic: the ability to think systematically about complex, interconnected problems. Champions didn't just react to events as they occurred. They thought through the second and third-order effects of various developments and positioned themselves to benefit from predictable consequences. When the French began making serious preparations for an invasion of Italy, most Italian leaders focused on the immediate military threat. Lorenzo, however, recognized that the invasion would create numerous secondary opportunities. Foreign occupation would disrupt existing trade relationships, creating openings for new commercial arrangements. Political upheaval would weaken some traditional power centers while strengthening others. The need for local expertise would give Italian leaders who cooperated with the French significant influence over occupation policies. By thinking through these second-order effects, Lorenzo was able to position Florence to benefit from developments that devastated less prepared city-states. While his competitors focused solely on military resistance, Lorenzo built a comprehensive strategy that included military, economic, and political elements. This systematic approach to complex problems enabled him to turn potential disasters into actual advantages. The champion's approach to communication represented another crucial area of distinction. Machiavelli observed that successful leaders were master communicators, but not in the way most people understood communication. They didn't necessarily give the most eloquent speeches or write the most beautiful prose. Instead, they had learned to communicate with maximum impact and minimum ambiguity. Their communications were carefully tailored to their audiences, with messages crafted to resonate with the specific interests and concerns of the people they were addressing. A champion might describe the same policy decision in completely different terms when speaking to merchants, soldiers, or clergy, emphasizing the aspects most relevant to each group while maintaining fundamental consistency in the underlying message. Cesare Borgia demonstrated this adaptive communication style throughout his military and political campaigns. When addressing his soldiers, he spoke in terms of honor, glory, and shared sacrifice. When negotiating with merchants, he focused on economic opportunities and commercial advantages. When dealing with church officials, he emphasized moral imperatives and religious duties. Yet all of these communications served his consistent strategic objectives. This communication flexibility extended beyond mere rhetoric to encompass timing, medium, and format. Champions understood that the same message might be most effective as a public proclamation in one situation, a private conversation in another, and a written document in a third. They considered not just what they wanted to communicate, but how their intended audience would be most receptive to receiving that communication. The ability to maintain message discipline across multiple audiences and communication channels required exceptional mental clarity about objectives and priorities. Champions had to be absolutely clear about what they were trying to achieve before they could craft communications designed to achieve those objectives. This clarity of purpose was another distinguishing characteristic that Machiavelli identified. Unlike many ambitious individuals who pursued power for its own sake, champions typically had specific visions of what they wanted to accomplish once they achieved their objectives. This sense of purpose provided them with strategic direction that guided their decision-making and helped them maintain focus during difficult periods. Francesco Sforza's rise to power in Milan illustrated this principle clearly. Sforza wasn't simply seeking to become duke for the prestige or wealth associated with the position. He had a specific vision of Milan as a dominant force in northern Italian politics, and every decision he made was evaluated against its contribution to that larger objective. This clarity of purpose enabled him to make consistent choices even when facing complex trade-offs and competing pressures. The presence of genuine purpose also enhanced champions' ability to inspire others. People could sense the difference between someone pursuing power for selfish reasons and someone driven by a larger vision that offered benefits to supporters and society. This authenticity of purpose made champions more compelling leaders and helped them attract higher-quality allies and subordinates. As Machiavelli's understanding of champion behavior deepened through years of observation and analysis, he began to recognize that these individuals had fundamentally different relationships with risk than ordinary people. While most individuals sought to minimize risk and uncertainty, champions understood that significant achievements required accepting significant risks. However, they didn't take risks carelessly or impulsively. They took calculated risks based on systematic analysis of potential costs and benefits. The champion's approach to risk management involved what Machiavelli termed asymmetric betting, seeking situations where potential gains significantly exceeded potential losses. They were willing to accept high probabilities of small losses in pursuit of low probabilities of enormous gains. This risk profile enabled them to pursue opportunities that more risk-averse individuals avoided, giving them access to higher potential rewards. Pope Julius II's decision to personally lead military campaigns exemplified this risk philosophy. The conventional wisdom held that popes should remain safely in Rome, directing military operations from a distance. Julius recognized that this conventional approach, while safer for him personally, significantly reduced his ability to inspire troops and make rapid tactical adjustments. By accepting the personal risks associated with field command, he gained tactical advantages that more than compensated for the increased danger. This willingness to accept personal risk in pursuit of strategic advantage extended beyond military situations to encompass political, economic, and social risks. Champions were willing to stake their reputations on bold initiatives, invest significant resources in uncertain ventures, and challenge powerful opponents when they believed the potential rewards justified the risks involved. However, risk-taking was always balanced with careful preparation and contingency planning. Champions didn't simply hope for the best, they systematically prepared for various possible outcomes and positioned themselves to benefit regardless of how events unfolded. This preparation enabled them to take risks that would have been foolhardy for less prepared individuals. The art of contingency planning revealed another dimension of champion thinking that Machiavelli found fascinating. These individuals possessed an unusual ability to hold multiple potential futures in their minds simultaneously, developing strategies that would work well under various scenarios. This mental flexibility enabled them to adapt quickly when circumstances changed, often turning unexpected developments to their advantage. Lorenzo de' Medici's handling of the Pazzi conspiracy demonstrated this adaptive capability perfectly. When assassins attacked him during Easter Mass in Florence Cathedral, Lorenzo didn't simply react to the immediate threat. He immediately began thinking through the political implications of the attack and positioning Florence's response to maximize long-term advantages. Even while bleeding from his wounds, he was considering how to use the assassination attempt to strengthen his position and weaken his enemies. This ability to think strategically during crisis situations was not natural talent but developed skill. Champions systematically exposed themselves to pressure and uncertainty, building their capacity to function effectively when stakes were high and time was limited. They practiced making decisions quickly with incomplete information, learned to manage their emotional responses to stress, and developed the mental discipline necessary to think clearly during chaos. The cultivation of crisis management skills reflected a broader champion characteristic that Machiavelli identified: the commitment to continuous improvement and learning. Unlike individuals who became satisfied with their current capabilities, champions constantly sought to develop new skills and enhance existing ones. They viewed themselves as works in progress rather than finished products. This learning orientation manifested itself in various ways. Champions actively sought out challenging assignments that would stretch their capabilities. They cultivated relationships with individuals who could teach them valuable skills or provide new perspectives. They studied the successes and failures of other leaders, extracting lessons that could be applied to their own situations. With trust, Cesare Borgia's approach to military education illustrated this commitment to continuous learning. Despite his natural tactical gifts, Borgia systematically studied the campaigns of history's greatest military leaders, analyzing their strategies and techniques. He sought out experienced commanders who could teach him advanced concepts and spent considerable time practicing complex maneuvers with his troops. This dedication to improvement enabled him to achieve military successes that surprised even his supporters. The champion's relationship with mentorship and teaching represented another area where Machiavelli observed distinctive patterns. Successful leaders understood the value of learning from others, but they also recognized their responsibility to develop the next generation of leaders. They viewed teaching and mentoring not as burdens, but as opportunities to extend their influence and create lasting impact. This teaching orientation served multiple strategic purposes. By developing the capabilities of their subordinates, champions created more effective organizations that could accomplish more ambitious objectives. By sharing their knowledge and insights, they built loyalty and commitment among their followers. By establishing themselves as sources of valuable learning, they attracted talented individuals who wanted to benefit from their expertise. Francesco Sforza's development of his military officers exemplified this approach to leadership development. Rather than hoarding his tactical knowledge or treating his subordinates as mere order followers, Sforza actively taught them the principles behind his decisions and encouraged them to develop their own strategic thinking abilities. This investment in human development created a military organization that remained effective even when Sforza was not personally present to direct operations. The systematic development of organizational capabilities reflected another key insight from Machiavelli's observations. Champions understood that personal excellence was necessary but insufficient for achieving truly significant objectives. The greatest accomplishments required building institutions and systems that could operate effectively beyond the direct involvement of any single individuals, no matter how capable. This institutional thinking distinguished champions from merely talented individuals. While talented people might achieve impressive personal successes, champions created lasting change that persisted beyond their own involvement. They built organizations, established traditions, and created systems that continued generating value long after their founders had moved on to other pursuits. Lorenzo de' Medici's patronage system exemplified this institutional approach to power and influence. Rather than simply hiring artists and scholars to serve his immediate needs, Lorenzo created a cultural ecosystem that made Florence the intellectual and artistic center of Europe. The institutions he established, the traditions he fostered, and the networks he built continued shaping European culture for centuries after his death. This long-term perspective required champions to think beyond their own immediate interests and consider the broader implications of their actions. They understood that their legacy would be determined not just by what they accomplished personally, but by the lasting impact of the systems and institutions they created. This perspective influenced their decision-making and helped them maintain focus on objectives that might take decades to achieve. As Machiavelli synthesized his years of observation and analysis, he began to understand that the champion mindset represented a fundamental transformation in how individuals related to power, responsibility, and achievement. Champions didn't simply want to be successful, they wanted to be indispensable. They didn't just seek to win competitions, they sought to transcend competition by operating in categories where they had no meaningful rivals. This transcendence of ordinary competitive dynamics was perhaps the most striking characteristic Machiavelli identified. While most ambitious individuals engaged in zero-sum competition with their peers, champions focused on creating new forms of value that benefited everyone involved. They understood that the most secure position was not to defeat all competitors, but to make competition irrelevant by becoming uniquely valuable. Pope Julius II's transformation of the papacy illustrated this principle of competitive transcendence. Rather than simply competing with other church officials for influence within existing structures, Julius redefined what it meant to be pope. He became simultaneously a religious leader, military commander, political strategist, and cultural patron. This multi-dimensional approach to leadership made him impossible to replace or replicate, because no potential rival possessed expertise across all the domains he had mastered. This multi-dimensional excellence required what Machiavelli termed Renaissance thinking, the ability to integrate insights and capabilities from diverse fields into coherent strategies for action. Champions didn't specialize narrowly in single areas of expertise. Instead, they developed broad competencies that enabled them to see connections and opportunities that specialists might miss. The cultivation of Renaissance thinking required systematic exposure to diverse fields of knowledge and experience. Champions read widely, traveled extensively, and engaged with experts from various disciplines. They understood that innovation often occurred at the intersections between different domains, and they positioned themselves to recognize and exploit these opportunities. Lorenzo de' Medici's integration of banking, politics, philosophy, and arts patronage created opportunities that would have been invisible to someone focused exclusively on any single domain. His understanding of financial markets informed his political strategies. His philosophical studies influenced his artistic preferences. His political connections enhanced his business opportunities. This integration of diverse capabilities made him extraordinarily effective and virtually impossible to replace. The development of integrated expertise also required what Machiavelli observed as another champion characteristic: intellectual courage. Champions were willing to challenge conventional wisdom, question established practices, and explore unconventional solutions. They understood that significant achievements often required thinking differently about familiar problems. This intellectual courage was not reckless contrarianism but thoughtful skepticism combined with creative problem-solving. Champions questioned assumptions not for the sake of being different but because they recognized that breakthrough solutions often required abandoning limiting beliefs about what was possible or necessary. Cesare Borgia's approach to military logistics demonstrated this intellectual courage. While his contemporaries accepted that armies moved slowly and required extensive supply trains, Borgia questioned whether these limitations were truly necessary. Through systematic experimentation and innovation, he developed more mobile and self-sufficient military units that could move faster and strike more quickly than conventional forces. This tactical innovation gave him significant advantages over enemies who remained constrained by traditional approaches. The willingness to challenge conventional wisdom extended beyond technical and tactical domains to encompass social and political conventions. Champions understood that many rules and limitations were arbitrary rather than fundamental, and they were willing to test boundaries when doing so served their objectives. However, this rule-breaking was always strategic rather than arbitrary. Champions didn't violate conventions for the sake of rebellion. They did so when conventional approaches were inadequate for achieving their objectives. They understood the difference between useful traditions that should be preserved and limiting assumptions that should be discarded. As Machiavelli reflected on the patterns he had observed throughout his years of studying political power, he recognized that champions possessed what he came to call sovereign thinking, the ability to make decisions based on their own assessment of situations rather than relying on external authorities or conventional wisdom. This intellectual independence was perhaps the most fundamental characteristic that distinguished champions from followers. Sovereign thinking required tremendous confidence in one's own judgment, but it was confidence earned through systematic development of analytical capabilities. Champions didn't simply trust their instincts. They developed reliable methods for evaluating complex situations and making sound decisions under uncertainty. They understood their own cognitive limitations and biases, and they created systems to compensate for these limitations. The development of sovereign thinking also required emotional independence from the approval and disapproval of others. Champions made decisions based on their assessment of what would achieve their objectives, not on what would make them popular or avoid criticism. This emotional independence enabled them to pursue unpopular but necessary courses of action when circumstances required difficult choices. Francesco Sforza's rise to power in Milan required numerous decisions that were criticized by contemporaries as overly aggressive or insufficiently respectful of established traditions. However, Sforza's analysis of the political situation convinced him that conventional approaches would not achieve his objectives. His willingness to ignore criticism and pursue his chosen strategy ultimately vindicated his judgment and established his position as one of Italy's most successful rulers. This independence from external validation reflected a deeper understanding of the relationship between leadership and responsibility. Champions understood that leadership meant accepting ultimate responsibility for outcomes, which required making decisions based on their own best judgment rather than deferring to popular opinion or established precedent. The acceptance of ultimate responsibility was both liberating and burdensome. It freed champions from the constraints of seeking consensus or approval for their decisions, but it also placed the full weight of consequences on their shoulders. This responsibility could not be shared or delegated. It was the price of sovereign authority. Pope Julius II's decision to personally lead military campaigns exemplified this acceptance of ultimate responsibility. By putting himself at physical risk, Julius demonstrated that he was willing to stake everything on his strategic vision. This commitment inspired tremendous loyalty among his followers and made his enemies take him more seriously as an opponent. The willingness to accept ultimate responsibility also required what Machiavelli observed as exceptional emotional resilience. Champions had to maintain their effectiveness despite criticism, setbacks, and failures. They needed to learn from mistakes without being paralyzed by them, accept criticism without being deflected from their objectives, and persist through difficulties without losing confidence in their capabilities. This emotional resilience was not natural immunity to stress and disappointment. It was developed capacity to process negative experiences constructively. Champions felt the same emotions as everyone else, but they had learned to channel those emotions into productive action rather than allowing them to become destructive forces. Lorenzo de' Medici's response to the Pazzi conspiracy demonstrated this emotional resilience clearly. The assassination attempt not only threatened his life, but also represented a fundamental challenge to his political position and personal dignity. However, Lorenzo channeled his anger and fear into a systematic campaign to identify and neutralize his enemies while strengthening Florence's defenses against future threats. Rather than being weakened by the attack, he emerged stronger and more secure than before. The cultivation of emotional resilience required systematic exposure to stress and uncertainty, combined with deliberate practice in managing emotional responses. Champions didn't avoid difficult situations. They sought them out as opportunities to build their psychological strength and develop their capacity for effective action under pressure. As Machiavelli concluded his analysis of the patterns he had observed among history's most successful leaders, he recognized that the champion mindset represented more than just a collection of useful techniques or strategies. It was a comprehensive approach to living that integrated personal excellence, strategic thinking, and moral purpose into a coherent philosophy of action. The champions he studied were not simply ambitious individuals who had learned effective techniques for acquiring power. They were people who had transformed themselves into instruments capable of achieving extraordinary objectives. This transformation required not just learning new skills, but fundamentally changing how they understood themselves and their relationship to the world around them. This personal transformation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of developing champion capabilities. It required abandoning comfortable assumptions about limitations and possibilities, accepting responsibility for outcomes that had previously seemed beyond individual control, and committing to standards of excellence that demanded continuous growth and improvement. The transformation also required what Machiavelli termed noble ambition, the desire to achieve something worthy of the effort and sacrifice required to develop champion capabilities. Champions were not motivated primarily by personal gain or glory, but by the opportunity to accomplish objectives that would benefit others and create lasting value. Cesare Borgia's vision of a unified Italy, Lorenzo de' Medici's commitment to cultural excellence, and Pope Julius II's determination to strengthen the Church all represented narrow self-interest. These larger purposes provided the motivation necessary to sustain the difficult process of personal transformation and the energy required to overcome the obstacles that accompanied ambitious objectives. The presence of noble ambition also served as a safeguard against the corrupting effects of power. Champions who remained focused on worthy objectives were less likely to abuse their capabilities or use their influence for purely selfish purposes. Their commitment to larger purposes provided both direction for their efforts and limits on their actions. In the final analysis, Machiavelli understood that the champion's path was not for everyone. It required capabilities and commitments that many people were unwilling or unable to develop. However, for those individuals who possessed both the talent and the dedication necessary for this transformation, the rewards extended far beyond personal success to encompass the satisfaction of achieving objectives that seemed impossible to ordinary individuals. The champion's journey was ultimately about transcending the limitations that constrained most people and discovering what became possible when those limitations were removed. It was about developing capabilities that enabled individuals to shape events rather than merely responding to them, to create opportunities rather than simply recognizing them, and to achieve objectives that others considered beyond reach. As the sun set over Florence and Machiavelli completed his observations, he understood that he had documented something more than political strategy or tactical advice. He had identified a pathway for human excellence that could be followed by anyone willing to pay the price in effort, sacrifice, and commitment required for true mastery. The champion's path remained open to those who possessed the vision to see it and the courage to walk it, regardless of their starting circumstances or inherited advantages. The lessons he had learned from observing the most successful leaders of his era would continue to guide ambitious individuals for centuries to come, providing them with both the inspiration and the practical guidance necessary to achieve their own forms of greatness. In documenting these patterns, Machiavelli had created a blueprint for personal transformation that would enable ordinary individuals to develop extraordinary capabilities and accomplish objectives that would otherwise remain forever beyond their reach. The path to becoming a champion was neither easy nor guaranteed, but it was available to anyone willing to commit to the systematic development of excellence in all dimensions of human capability. Those who chose to walk this path would discover, as had the great leaders of Renaissance Italy, that the greatest limitations on human achievement were not external circumstances, but internal assumptions about what was possible for individuals who refused to accept ordinary standards of performance and ordinary definitions of success.